So if that's right. Okay, so welcome, Paul, and thank you for welcome back from your overseas travels, and thank you for the work you do. I heard you present this at Aldersgate, and I just said, oh no, we've got to get this out wider. We've got to record it. What you're saying is just so important. So on behalf of the Wild, we're south of the Tuesday Club. We also have relationships with people in Auckland occasionally. So welcome and thank you very much. Over to you.
Thank you. So just to explain to everybody what I've just said is that I'm a co-director of He Whenua Taurikura, which is a specialist unit inside DPMC. So one of the things that has me, as that co-director, has me concerned is what's happened in the last 3 to 5 years, which has had an impact on New Zealand society. And so next Tuesday, Sir Peter Gluckman and I will be releasing a report on social cohesion. And what that report will say is 2 things. One is that, this is advance notice, one is that our trust in our core institutions, including government, but our police, our media, has dropped considerably. And we have an issue with the social online media, social media. And we're not quite sure what we need to do about it. So what I thought I'd do is just quickly go through. I have to explain to all of you, I began looking at these issues quite a long time ago. I was sitting in London and sitting in Bristol trying to think of a thesis topic. And I had a couple of incidents which occurred near me in Bristol. Some young National Front members held down a young Pakistani boy, a 13-year-old, and they carved a swastika in his stomach with a razor blade. And I was pretty appalled by that behaviour. I thought, you know, a lot of our values, a lot of our institutions had come from the UK, and this wasn't what I was expecting. And then a week or so later, an Indian woman answered her front door in Birmingham wearing a sari, and she had petrol poured over and she was set alight. So I thought I'd look at the National Front and National Party. And just to make it clear, the National Party at the time, the British National Party, were nothing to do with our National Party. So I began this journey a long time ago. I came back to New Zealand and I said to our security services and SIS, police and various other agencies, the Human Rights Commission or the Race Relations Conciliator as it was then, do we have similar groups in New Zealand? They all said, no, we don't. So there was a sort of exceptionalist argument that went around. And I used to annoy people, including a certain mayor of Christchurch, a certain Gary Moore, by pointing out that there were some centres around New Zealand, including Christchurch, where actually these groups were active. So I'm going to come back to this in a moment, but what I see is a significant turn in terms of our politics, and I've got some of the issues there in a rather nice Financial Times cover there, the politics in the age of vitriol. And what we've seen is, I think, a rise yet again in places like France, Sweden, Italy, Hungary, the USA, where people are wanting to stop other people coming in, and I'll talk a bit more about that. And we've also seen a significant decline in mass political parties. In the 1970s, in the UK, both the Conservatives and Labour would have had north of 2 million members, paid-up members. Currently, neither political party has more than 200,000 paid-up members. And combine that with the economic and social uncertainty and online possibilities, and we've got a very different set of politics emerging. Now, some of this has a long history, and so I've mentioned, and I will mention at the risk of annoying Gary yet again, mention Christchurch and tax reduction integrity movements. So there were groups around, there were others who were very pro-empire, you know, we should keep ourselves as a sort of Britain of the South Seas. And of course, they argued for white supremacy in South Africa. And then, of course, we had the National Front, and some of you will recognise some of the people that are pictured there. And what annoyed me was that we tended to deny that we had issues in terms of white supremacist and exclusive nationalist movements. In South Island prisons in the 1990s, we had 20-odd skinheads, and I never knew why corrections didn't see skinheads as a gang like any other gang. But Fourth Reich was established in 1994, and as they came out of prison and they spread around the South Island, they were almost exclusively a South Island phenomenon, to places like Timaru, Blenheim, Nelson, Hokitika, Westport, Invercargill. They expressed their white supremacy in various ways. And some of you will remember, this is Chaston, who is a particularly nasty member of the Fourth Reich. So not only has he got crimes of violence and murder, has he been convicted of crimes of violence and murder, he's also a sexual predator. And you might remember some of the murders, the Korean backpacker on the West Coast, the Maori gay man in Westport, were all killed by members of the Fourth Reich. So we had those. And then, of course, we had right-wing resistance, which, as far as I can tell, is the one far-right movement that we've exported to the rest of the world. And you will know Kyle Chapman, who remains active to this day, particularly in sort of anti-vax and anti-government protests. And after it was formed, we had a Swedish president and an American vice president. So it was one of those few organizations that we grew in New Zealand and exported elsewhere. Now, what I want to argue is that the internet has changed the possibilities for these sorts of groups. And we have a pretty unregulated frontier in terms of the internet. You can broadcast, as you all know, broadcast to as many as you like, that one-to-many, anonymous, no filters, and completely radical circulation. And I wrote the cabinet paper on social cohesion in 2006, and I got a couple of things badly wrong. And one of them was anticipating this growth. But in my defense, I would say it has really occurred since about 2015 and 16. And we've got a couple of, and what's peculiar about this is that it's an online ecosystem which is now dominated in New Zealand by what's happening in the United States. So QAnon, politics, the politics of Trump, you know, the exclusive nationalism that I referred to before. And there are two bits to this. One of them is the alt-right and the other is identitarian. And the identitarian arguments were really crystallized by a French writer, Camus, in 2012, when he argued that there was a great replacement going on. And the replacement was that the Muslim world was replacing the white Christian world in white Christian countries as he saw them. And as you can see there, he was very anti-multicultural, very anti-immigration, and increasingly anti-Semitic and Islamophobic. And I think most of us realized what this meant in the Charlottesville protests in 2017, when the chant was, "They will not replace us," or "Jews will not replace us." And then there's the alt-right, which was formed really, well, earlier on it was established, but it really gained pace post-2016. And it was energized and mandated by what was happening in Trump's America. And what I think we should understand is that the alt-right has reformed its image. Its image online is quite often relatively polite. And when you see the people, they are unlike the skinheads that we'd seen earlier. So they were less visibly obvious. However, they did produce groups like the Proud Boys and, of course, the occupation of Congress. We have these groups in New Zealand. Some of the groups after March 2019 disappeared. The Dominion movement disappeared. But to this day, you can look at Action Zealandia. You can go on your website. What you'll see there is exactly what I've been talking about, replacement theory. The idea that behind this is a global struggle, which is the deep state in New Zealand, but also the UN. And what they talk about is white ethno-genocide. Action Zealandia is a male-only organisation. It is primarily, but not exclusively, either made up of university students or university graduates, very white middle class, and very active at various times. Very active here in Auckland, to some extent in Wellington, to some extent in Christchurch, but mostly in Auckland. So we've got our own examples. And then, of course, Christchurch happened. And I was part of a meeting that was held in 2017 between the Muslim leadership and government departments. And the Muslim leadership said at the time, do you realise how we're being targeted online in particular, but also in person, and what was happening? And unfortunately, government departments in the room, and particularly one government department, didn't take that take that, and of course, March happened. And what we saw was an individual who'd been radicalised online, who'd then proceeded to act out his views. And you can see the identitarian and the alt-right politics in those views. And of course, what we now have, unfortunately, is Christchurch as part of an international set of events. And Norway preceded Christchurch, but El Paso and Hanau, that Walmart in the US and Hanau in Germany, have continued it. And both the shooters in El Paso and Hanau both referenced the Christchurch shooter. I'd always argued that the notion that New Zealand was somehow exceptional and that wouldn't be tasked, it wouldn't experience these sorts of things. I always felt uncomfortable with that, and I always pointed out that it only required one person, and it gives me no satisfaction to say that that was happened. Now let's come back to to what's been happening. Particularly during COVID, we've seen this rise of mis and disinformation. And I want to come around to what it means politically for New Zealand. But what we have is what's called the Overton window, and that is the attempt to move the political right to the centre, so that the attempt is to normalise these politics of white supremacy, of an exclusive nationalism. But what we get is this amplification, this platform for very aggressive, very angry voices. So one of our tasks is at He Whenua Taurikura is to understand what radicalises people and what radicalises people online. And the image here, you'll remember, the image is actually of that police officer in Christchurch, leaving aside the face. You might remember that she was a Pākehā police officer, and she put on a hijab and wore the red rose in sympathy with the Muslim community. And what they've done is replace the face with Jacinda Ardern face. What we've got is misinformation, which is getting the facts wrong. And so what we see is a lot of that, and particularly during the Wellington protest, that increased significantly. But we also have disinformation, which false information is being deliberately spread in order to mislead. And again, we saw that rise through COVID. And I think it was that anxiety that COVID produced, plus things like the mandate, which got particular groups offside because they were not allowed to work in their professions. Now, can I come back to this? Because part of what I've done over the last 40 years is track anti-Semitism in New Zealand. We've done 4 surveys of the Jewish community in New Zealand. In 3 of those surveys, the level of reported anti-Semitism from the Jewish community was very low. However, in the last survey in 2019, it was growing. And there has been a survey since. And that survey now shows that the level of anti-Semitism experienced by New Zealand Jews is similar to what you would see in the rest of the world. So there's been a significant escalation. And the Anti-Defamation League, which tracks these issues very carefully, has seen since 2017 a year-on-year rise. And what I draw your attention to is the fact that about 5 million anti-Semitic tweets per day appear. And what we have, and so here I come back to Christchurch, we've got an unattractive individual like Philip Arps, who put on his van 1488. And so I'm sure most of you are aware of this, but 14 is the David Lane sentence about preserving the future for white children. So David Lane was a neo-Nazi in the United States, now dead, died in prison. But it's a 14-word sentence about preserving the future for whites. And then 88 is Heil Hitler. The three parentheses are because there are online triggers for words that mean that you'll be blocked. So you don't use certain words, but what happens here is the parentheses indicates to others that you're talking about a Jewish organization or a Jewish person. So you use those parentheses. And what has dismayed me is that anti-Semitic slogans, so the Jew-Cinder stuff. And I got a sense of that in 2020 when I was listening to a Billy Te Kahika. So remember, he was one of the leaders of one of the minor political parties in the last election, in which he was talking, he's quite engaging, but he was talking on a podcast in June 2020, and about halfway through he started to talk about the Rothschilds, and I thought, here we go, and indeed here we went. And so he just had this rant about Jews controlling everything in New Zealand. And so, as you can see from one of these headlines, protests became an anti-Semitic super spreader in New Zealand. And of course, alongside that, we've got Islamophobia. And what's unusual, and so I've got here a Guardian headline, and after the Christchurch shooting, hate crimes against Muslims actually spiked around the world, and online hate towards Muslims actually spiked in New Zealand. Now, it died down, but there's something going on which we need to understand in terms of what's happening in these attacks against faith and ethnic minority communities. I'm racing through this because I want a chance to talk to you guys. One of the issues that has become an international issue, and this is from the conversation in Australia, so this is an Australian research, is that our democratic systems being undermined by this extremism online and by what's happening in social media. So that's a question that I think we need to ask about New Zealand. And for me, when I'm being asked about it in the media, I talk about stickability, and I don't know whether that's a word or not. But what I mean is that the anti-government, anti-politicians, anti-media, anti-expert views that we saw circulated through 2022, and particularly in those protests around the country. I visited the one in Picton, where there was a camp which was similar to the one in Wellington at Parliament. And I don't know whether those views are going to continue on. Now, what I've got to say is that there was an event over the weekend in Dunedin in which some of these communities and activists from this part of the political spectrum broke up a meeting that was being held in Dunedin over the weekend. And you've had one or two events. David Seymour was attacked at a meeting in Christchurch last year. So it's not confined to the Labour Party or the Green Party, it is across the spectrum.
And John Luxton too.
Yes, and John Luxton too. Now, what we're starting to see in the mix is some particular elements. And what I want to highlight here is the misogyny of what's happening in New Zealand. So Chris Wilson and the team at the University of Auckland looked at abusive and toxic online posts concerning New Zealand politicians. So there was 5,000, a sample of 5,438, quite a few really. But what you'll notice is that 93% of them targeted Jacinda Ardern. And she received, last year, she received 55 death threats. So again, I've got a Guardian report here in which they talk about the then Prime Minister being a lightning rod for these threats during COVID. And it does appear to be quite an intense and relatively recent, not completely recent, of course, growth in what's happening. And so I attended a groundswell protest last year, in December last year, and I took these images of some of the signs. And as you can see, there was a strong, I would have said well over half of all the signs at the groundswell protest were focused on the then Prime Minister, and some pretty, and these are not the most offensive ones, by the way, some pretty offensive material. So I'm speaking personally here. I don't know what happened and why it happened, but I'm quite clear that I think Jacinda Ardern as our Prime Minister, her safety was being threatened, and I don't think she could have continued to be Prime Minister. I think she would have faced an ongoing barrage of toxic online and threats. And I've got here some of the headlines from last year about what happened in our court system. I don't think people quite understand this, but it certainly is as one of those indicators that we've got rather different political environment. And going back to the conversation, and I'm just about to finish up here, but going back to the conversation research, which is very early, so we really need to explore this, and we need to explore this in a New Zealand context. The digital world does encourage political engagement, and I would look at somebody like Klaus Vorbrick here in Auckland. When she ran for the mayoralty race here against Phil Goff, she mobilized a whole world of millennials and Generation Z online, which was very impressive, I've got to say. So what we can agree is that digital media are a supplement and certainly impact upon certain demographics, but they've also significantly increased polarization and populism. And what we see is these attacks on the media, on politicians, on what's happened during COVID. And we can get what's called the Edelman Trust Barometer, has produced a report about a month ago, which looks internationally, by the way, and it shows the international trust in core democratic systems has declined very significantly during COVID. New Zealand's has declined too. It's not as bad as some other countries, but it has declined, and it's amplified these political divides. So there's clear evidence that what happens on social media has real world consequences, in this case in terms of politics, but also in terms of the politics that I talked about before, identitarian and alt-right politics. So QAnon has been a very significant influence on New Zealand. If you looked at those parliamentary protests, you would have seen a lot of American flags, a lot of Trump MAGA hats. You would have seen claims about the election being stolen. I did a South Island trip last year, and you know, you'd get to a place like Takaka, and you'd see these signs and like at the side of the road, you know, the election was stolen. It was quite clear they were talking about the American election, which is something that I don't quite understand. A couple of concluding slides. This is us, He Whenua Taurikura, and what we're trying to do is commission research and understand what's happening in New Zealand. So our goal is to counter and prevent terrorism and violent extremism, but we also want to contribute to social cohesion. So one of the issues that we are struck with, one of the challenges we're struck with, is how do you rebuild social cohesion in this world. And I want to end on a Christchurch note. In 1973, I was at the University of Otago, and Sir Karl Popper was brought back to New Zealand by one of his students, Alan Musgrave, who was a professor of philosophy. And for that year, the philosophy of science course was taught by Alan and Sir Karl Popper. And I hope you know his history, but he spent 7 years in Christchurch at what was then the University of New Zealand, but which is now the University of Canterbury. His book, The Open Society and Its Enemies, which is considered one of the top 10 books of the 20th century in terms of influence, was written while he was in Christchurch. So you can lay claim to one of the most impressive books that were written last century. Karl, while he was here, I mean, he was an Austrian Jew who came to escape the Nazis in Europe. And while he was here, he formed a committee to try and get Nazi refugees brought to New Zealand. And he failed. And he failed because the head of the relevant department was a guy called R.A. Lahore, who was an anti-Semite. And he actually said that Jews did not fit with the Anglo-Saxon nature of New Zealand. So we didn't accept very many Jewish refugees at all. We did after the war, but not prior to the war. So Sir Karl and his colleagues didn't succeed in that. But this is a quote from The Open Society, which, if you can read. So it's the idea that by extending unlimited tolerance to the intolerant, the possibility is that the tolerance that is at the core of our very democratic system might be under challenge. And that's my concern. I just am not sure about what recruits people, radicalizes people, convinces them that our core public institutions, our core democratic system is broken. And yet we can see right around the world that there are constituencies that believe that. So that, I think, is one of our enduring challenges. How do we moderate the negative aspects of social media while utilizing their positive aspects? And then what we've seen since 2016-17, and particularly in 2022, the rise of these low trust politics, these very anti-institutional politics, anti-government politics. How embedded are they now in our community, and what will they mean for the general election that's coming up later this year? And I don't know the answer to that. I mean, the evidence will be seen as we proceed through this year, but I am very concerned. Rosemary, that's me. And can I stop sharing? Yes, I'll stop sharing. There we are. Thanks. And I'm quite happy to take questions and arguments.
Thanks so much, Paul. Why don't people, if you have a question or even a comment, throw it into chat. Otherwise you can put your hand up or digitally.
Oh, Gary.
Or,
do I have to take Gary's? No.
He hasn't put his hand up yet.
I did.
Oh, he did. Oh, no, a digital hand, Gary. You don't get allowed to talk unless you can use a digital hand.
You go ahead, Gary. You go ahead.
No, Paul, I was always, I went, because I...
Yeah, no. You and I on Paul Holmes or whatever it was, yeah.
The thing that I've always said is that yes, although the media focus in on Christchurch, yes, the number of people who are involved in these movements is minuscule.
Yes.
And the example I would give is Philip Arps stood for the board of Te Arawhai College, which is Linwood College.
Yes.
And was, I think, the lowest polling candidate. So at a local school, he did this big publicity, his name was out there, and he just didn't do, there was no local support in the community he lives in.
Mm.
And I think that's, and I know Carl and crew, I've worked with them. I worked with them in economic development in the 80s.
Yes.
And there's always been cells. I don't know why. There's a big cell in Timaru,
Mm-hmm.
and there has been since the 1980s. And there was white gangs down there,
Mm-hmm.
and they've remained, and they're still there.
Yes.
And what we tried to do at one stage is because the most vulnerable group in our society right now are poor whites.
Mm.
They don't have, like when we worked in economic development, there was always an old Māori auntie or a Pacific old auntie that we could actually say, hey, Gary's not behaving himself, can you pull him into line, sort of stuff. You go into the white community and there's virtually nobody that you can call on that they will listen to. So they're severely alienated. And at one stage, we tried to clean Carl Chapman's act up, which I might say lasted about 10 minutes.
Yes.
But the other guy that worked with him has turned into a fine local leader.
Mm.
And he took a lot of young ones, alienated ones out of it. So it's often a case of actually getting in amongst them, but it's very small number of people.
Yes. And I agree entirely with that, Gary. I mean, when I did my work through the 80s and 90s, I identified more than 80 groups, but most of them you could meet in a telephone box. You know, there weren't that many. The biggest was the League of Rights, which probably had about 1,200 active members. But that was based in Tauranga, so
Yeah.
Christchurch is off the hook there. And I agree with you. And I think the thing that I would say is that one of the things that has happened post-earthquake is that Christchurch has changed big time in terms of, you know, those poor whites, as you've said, and what happens in the community. Can I come back to that? Because I was at University of California, Berkeley in 2010, and there was a new political party that was just being formed that year called the Tea Party. So I went along, and they were the precursor of a lot of what we're talking about, the alternative right. And they struck me as a very hodgepodge group and not particularly big, although they've got some members of Congress and the Senate. And we had a meeting that year at Berkeley, and a lot of people said, they're small, they're not going to amount to much, we need to educate them, they just don't understand. And a woman called Ali Hochschild, who wrote a fantastic book about why poor whites in America were going to support people like Trump, won the New York Times prize. And what Ali said was, what you don't understand is that America is changing. And right throughout the Rust Belt, there are poor whites who are looking for new political leadership. And they eventually found that in Trump, of course. And she said, you cannot dismiss them as being ill-informed or misguided. You've got to understand what it is that they're concerned about. And she always talked about a cue to the American dream. And she said these poor whites were seeing Latinos, gays, feminists or women jumping that queue and getting really angry about it. So they needed to find a way out of that. And that's, of course, where you find these Trump supporters. And I think we ignore the marginalized and the poor and the people who are feeling impoverished in New Zealand. I think they're always going to be open to being recruited to these sorts of politics. So that's my concern, Gary, that we are ignoring them, not ignoring them, perhaps that's the wrong word, but we need to understand and bring them along in a way that doesn't push them out to some of these extreme politics. Sorry, that was a long answer. It was a long statement, so I'll blame you. Rosemary, you asked a question.
Yes, I put that in. No, it wasn't so much why was, now that Jacinda's not to the focus,
Yeah.
What will be their next focus, do you think? You know, I mean, it was a lightning rod.
Yes. Let me come to that. But what we saw is a whole lot of people that were part of particular constituencies, anti-1080, anti-5G, anti-UN, anti-compact, anti-fluoridation. And what COVID did was bring those groups together. And so what they do is they've got quite a significant online presence. Gary is right, they are highly fractured. So it's going to be interesting to see, you know, whether Brian Tamaki can bring them together, or whether Leighton, Chantel and I've forgotten his name, will bring them together. But what you see is that they move the target, and the target this year has been trans. So Posey Parker and all of that, you see the anti-trans, the transphobic focus on it. And I think they'll continue to find those sorts of campaign points, those hot button points. I'm picking they'll go, you know, anti-woke, whatever it'll be, but they'll come out fighting with another focus. By the way, you said that now that Jacinda's gone, you should have a look at the online comments about the Jacinda Ardern being made a dame over the weekend.
Okay.
Wow. The anti-Jacinda Ardern stuff has not gone away. There are some horrific comments about her being made a dame over the weekend. So that will probably percolate on. Brian, you've got your hand up. Oh.
Yeah, I have. And can you hear me now?
Yes, absolutely.
That was great. I must admit I struggle a bit with that Karl Popper statement. Just trying to get a handle around the whole tolerance and intolerance thing, but
yes,
I'll work on that.
Okay.
I just made a couple of notes about the decline in democracy.
Yes.
And it linked to social media. You know, this Tuesday Club, we've been on about participatory democracy for a long time. And we feel like one of these gangs that are not included, you know?
Yes.
And I just wonder if with social media, the Wild West nature of it,
yes,
and all that is exposing the cracks in democracy, which is the participatory form of it is being exposed in the Wild West.
yes.
If you know what I'm saying?
Yeah, I do.
And that there's a sort of underlying scream for inclusion. But you know, as we know, politics is pretty elite based.
Yeah.
And this is what's happening with these new technologies is it's starting to expose, hey, we want to be included.
Yeah.
We're going about it a pretty crazy way.
Yes.
Now, I'll just leave that with you.
Yes. Well,
the other thing.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, Karen, bro.
The other thing to layer on that is the slow, not demise, but the slow refitting, the repositioning of patriarchy. You know, the male position of that is every lot of males have been brought up expecting to be. And all of a sudden, you know, there are female prime ministers and all sorts of stuff that challenge the very nature of the maleness, the alpha of the previous maleness, the maleness of the patriarchy, and that this is a bit hard to handle. You know, we can't get our head around it, so we push back on it. And so I just thought I would throw those two ideas with you. I think that's enough.
Yes, no, thank you. So I've started a project on nostalgia, and I want to map why people want to go back to when we didn't have female prime ministers, what that looks like, and who's arguing for it. So I agree with you in that respect. Going to your other two, what Peter Gluckman and I argue is that social media could be used to enhance participatory democracy, but we're not doing it. And the question is, why aren't we doing it? Why aren't we using social media? So I used the example of Chloe Swarbrick before, and it's really quite impressive in the way that she talks to her constituency, and she does it in a quite different way. So when I chaired a mayoralty meeting, and Phil Goff was a very traditional male politician, a fairly orthodox politician, and the contrast between him and Chloe was very marked, and they were talking to two quite different audiences. And I am worried that our younger New Zealanders aren't participating in our democratic system in the way that they should. There's one thing I would say, Brian. The Christchurch call has been a huge success, and we are moving into a new phase. So the Christchurch call sits alongside where I sit in Department of Prime Minister and Cabinet, and it's headed up by a guy called Paul Ash. And as you'll know, Jacinda Ardern and Macron were the two leading lights. And Jacinda Ardern continues as a special envoy on that particular project. But it's got a lot of momentum. And many countries are facing what New Zealand is facing, and that is that our platforms and our social media are not controlled or subject to control by us. They are international platforms that come to us and bring all these influences that I've talked about tonight. And how do we moderate that? And how do we, because we can't have people going online threatening to kill a prime minister or threatening to kill Jews or Muslims or Maori. We just can't have it, and so we need to be able to do. And there are some acts, the digital harmful digital communications act is there, but we are struggling, and we're struggling big time. And my naive answer would be to say, why don't we make them publishers? So if I attacked Gary Moore and said something unsavoury and untrue about him, Gary can sue me for defamation. And if the Herald have published that, then they are also respondents in that court action. Why don't we make social media sites, Facebook, TikTok, whatever it is, Twitter, why don't we make them publishers? And therefore, if they publish something online, which is defamatory and breaches a certain standard, and we've got those standards in our law already, why can't we make them subject to a lawsuit? Well, that's the naive part of it. And of course, what I need to recognise is that that's never going to happen. Many of these are businesses that are as large as the New Zealand economy, and they're not going to be subject to the law that prevails in New Zealand. I mean, it's just hopeless. So I think we do have a problem.
I'll say
Rosemary?
something here about because I'm a bit involved in social media advertising and things like that. The interesting thing is that I'd love to know how much money is spent on Facebook and Twitter advertising, for instance, and none of it attract, because I pay bills, none of it attracts GST, none of it is giving anything back to this country, which I just think is outrageous. And anybody who has money can actually say, well, I want to target these people and tell them a lie. There's nothing to stop them doing that, is there?
No, none whatsoever. And when you look at the amount of tax paid anywhere by Facebook or Twitter or so on, it's laughable. It is really, these are companies that not only do they not adhere to good public and civic practice in terms of what they put on. I mean, Elon Musk at the moment is just, it's a nightmare what's happening on Twitter, but they also are not good public citizens in terms of paying what they should in terms of particular constituencies. Again, I would do something, I think, where their clients are, where the people that use their products are, then they should pay tax. But again, that's not going to happen. So I'm with you on that, Rosemary.
So are there any moves in the world in which you move to actually regulate some of this?
Yes, there are. I spent 2.5 months in Europe last year, and I spent most of that at Max Planck in Germany. And I don't know what's happening with and the Germans are hard line. So what they've done is they've set up a government agency, which has been there for a long time, and that is designed to identify and counteract any sort of racism, anti-Semitism, nationalism. And when social media companies came along, what they said was that if you, Facebook, post something which is racist, anti-Semitic, whatever, then you are going to be, and you don't remove it immediately, then you are going to be fined huge amounts of euro dollars, like billions of euro dollars. And so what Facebook then did was recruit 1,000 German language moderators. And so what the German government did, but the German government's very hard line on these sorts of issues, even though it faces internal opposition to what it, there's strong anti-immigrant, anti-racist movements in Germany. But the German government moderates the system, and the president, Steinmeier, is fantastic when it comes to these sorts of issues. Remember, he convinced all the cathedrals in Germany to turn out their lights to protest anti-refugee politics. So he's done some quite interesting things, and he's very staunch on these sorts of issues. But we're 100 miles from where Germany is, so we're not going to do what Germany does anytime soon.
And what do you see as the biggest risks for us in this election year? One of the things I noticed is that even myself, working with people in the Green movement, just how much has changed in 3 years, in that 3 years. Like even in the last 3 years, enormous changes, not just, well, partly because of COVID and what do you think? I mean, we're getting disruption of meetings. That's going to be people standing on these platforms. But can you see others?
Yeah, well, interestingly, from both parts of the political spectrum. So the bachelor co-governance meetings around the country, what they've done, I don't know whether you saw what happened in Levin the other night, but what they did was they filtered people coming in at the door and said no Maori involved, no Maori allowed inside in the meeting. You're going to disrupt the meeting. You're not allowed in. And then, of course, we had that.
What was the meeting about?
Bachelor, who's a school teacher turned preacher, from far north, and he's doing a road trip around New Zealand.
Okay.
And talking about how the Maoris are going to take over. So he's got a very strong position, and he targets co-governance, but he talks about the tribes taking over New Zealand and not allowing anybody else to go to the beach, or he's got a fairly extreme message. But then we had that meeting in Dunedin the other day when we saw a group of anti-vax people who tried to talk over the purpose of the meeting, which was around health, and to promote anti-vax politics. So I think we're getting some hints of what we're going to see is that the disruption of the meeting. And I was just trying to think what that might mean. Do you say, well, this is a Labour-only meeting in Christchurch, so unless you can show that you're a member of the party or an affiliate to the party, you're not allowed inside the meeting. I don't know what that means, Rosemary, in terms of our politics. Some of this strikes me as quite bizarre. The sovereign citizens movement, for example, I don't know whether you've been watching what they've been doing, but they've been doing some absurd things. I mean, why would you have a movement in New Zealand which believed in an 1877 act in the United States, which empowered local sheriffs to believe that if you get stopped in Christchurch for a speeding offence, you don't have to give any information to a police officer. That police officer represents a state which has no control over you. Some of it's quite difficult to explain, really. And so I think some of these some of these will percolate on through the election campaign and could, and I hope don't, disrupt our political debates. I mean, going back to Brian's point, I think there is a room for social media, but I hope it never displaces face-to-face meetings where we don't have to agree with a person, but we do need to respect the right of them to hold their views. And what I see in some of these politics is a complete disrespect, a complete, I don't believe you. I've had it today where I got challenged at a meeting, that a speech that I gave here by an anti-vaxxer who said, you know, vaxxers are this, this, and this. And I said, well, that's not what the science. He said, no, my science is right, your science is wrong. And so at that point, you know, I just said, so, well, how can we have a discussion if you're going to say that?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Hey, thanks very much, Paul. It looks like Gary's just unmuted himself.
Oh, is he?
I got I thought, Paul, you'd be interested. I got an email today from Quentin Wilson, who publishes really interesting books.
Yes.
And he's just, they're about to print a book by Dennis Welsh.
Okay.
And it's called We Need to Talk About Norman. And it's this book by veteran journalist and political commentator is aimed at recovering what Norman Kirk stood for.
Oh,
A
wow.
sense of government with a clear moral purpose in which there is daylight between public service and the commercial world. And he's arguing that Kirk never supported neoliberalism and the widening inequality that's occurring in our society. And basically to have a decent debate.
Yes.
Which is what a bit of what Brian was suggesting, that we actually really promote the good sort of stuff that you're talking about.
Yeah.
And it happens in little cells all around New Zealand. And if we can promote this, we can, and I think that this is, like, I joined the Labour Party because of Norman Kirk.
Yes.
And I left the Labour Party because his vision and dreams had gone.
Yes.
And so this might be, we'll get Dennis Welsh on here. We might include you in our email list, Paul, so you can have his column.
Yeah, I mean, he used to write those columns in the Listener, didn't he? He's an interesting guy. Yeah, I've just been to Washington.
I was just going to say, isn't that one of the issues about don't actually have a political debate anymore?
No.
We don't actually have a debate anymore. It's you have people stating their positions. And most of our public meetings are around people stating their positions, not working with the ideas.
No, it's that they want to shout at you, but never to listen to you, Rosemary.
That's right.
And so
we do too.
Yeah. But hopefully we do listen, and we do listen respectfully. So even though you don't, Rosemary doesn't agree with me, I think we can have a debate, and there are things we can agree on and the things we can disagree on. And it's that we get too much disagreement, I think. Can I just respond to Gary's point? I've just been up to Washington to chair a meeting at the World Bank. And then I was stupid. I went back a week later and opened the major Canadian conference on immigration. New Zealand has a good reputation around the world, and Christchurch has a particularly good reputation. What happened after the earthquake, and then what happened after the March 2019 shootings, are seen as civic communities coming together in the face of tragedy in a way that was really quite remarkable. And so what I want to say to you guys is that Christchurch comes up for both the good and the bad, the bad being the shooter, but the good being how Christchurch responded. And I remember that event in Hagley Park. And the things that, so what I did was at the meeting in Washington, I thought, because I was chairing it, I thought I had the right to do something. So what I did was I played the song Whakaria Mai that was sung by
Yeah.
Oh dear.
And looked Muslim. She was Māori. And I explained to them what whakaarea mai was a translation of, and that the translator was the chaplain to the Māori battalion during the Second World War, Huerta, Canon Wee Huerta, Canon Wee Huerta. And the symbolism and why it should be sung at an event to recognise people, a Muslim community that had been involved in this tragedy. And, you know, people were genuinely moved, and one or two of them to tears, I've got to say. So, you know, Gary, there are moments when there is a lot of good that is done. Unfortunately, it's often tragedy which then promotes that. And it seems to me that, you know, some of that in 2019 that we saw in Christchurch after that tragedy, what happened in 2020 undermined that some way. And I think it's that we need to think about how we increase trust and how we increase respect for people that are very different.
And maybe Rosemary, you could finish off by
Yes.
actually telling that fantastic story that you learned from that Muslim man this weekend.
Yes, it's one I find I can't say without tearing up myself. But anyway, it was a young man who was at one of the mosques, and he was escaped unharmed and rushed home and gathered his family and his children up and locked themselves in a room to protect themselves, because they thought this person was still at large. They had no idea, and they thought they were going to have to leave this country. And he said he heard a noise, and he opened the curtain, and he saw his neighbors had gathered around outside his house to protect him.
Wow. That's great.
And that was the kind of
Yeah.
and I think one of the things that the reason it brings tears to my eyes is that that's us at our best.
Yes.
And how do we encourage us to be at our best?
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
hey, so thank you very much, Paul, for coming.
I know it's been a pleasure talking to you, and I noticed Chrissy's see, we ran out of time, but I don't know how to answer your question about the current mayor, so I'm going to leave that one. I have no idea. But lovely talking to you, and I hope you get a sense that we are working hard, whether it's with Sir Peter Gluckman and Koitua, or whether it's He Whenua Taurikura, to really encourage trust. And the one thing that I would say, Rosemary and Gary, is that I do think we're let down by our media. I think that how we understand some of these issues, how we understand other communities, we've lost a lot of long form journalism, and I think we've lost a lot of the debates that we should be having around the place. Even if Gary and I disagree and I get told off by Gary in front of the media, we can do that, but we're not doing that. We're not doing that really at the moment, very much at all. So how do we re-establish that, I think, is our common challenge.
Well, and as well as Rosemary's comments, thank you, Paul. It's absolutely fantastic. And if you want to spread, you know, ideas or get debate happening, 1,400 people over 1,400 get our emails whenever we do them, which is one or every week or every second week. Yes. And so if you want to encourage people, because it's a group of people that actually are very seriously interested in political debate and a decent society. Yes. So, and I really do applaud your work and Peter Gluckman's work, and all the best. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed. Thank you, everybody. Thank you. Cheers.
Bye.
Bye.